Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join me to go through some of the features within NetSuite pertaining to production distribution. In the last few years, NetSuite has invested a fair bit of development money into building some particular areas that they felt needed to be improved, and one of those is MRP, which I'll focus on today. Another area is costing manufacturing in terms of bill of materials and looking at the actual costs. So today's session is going to be it's going to be broken up into two parts. One part is going to be related to a presentation I'll give you in relation to some of the functionalities around planning, demand planning and supply planning of inventory and bill of materials and finished products. And then the other half will be actually demonstrating that solution. So we've only got an hour, so I'll get cracking and feel free to ask any questions. And I can see Terry Ann's just put that into the chat. So if you have any questions, please ask them, and I'll get to them as we go. So please make this as interactive as possible. That would be great. So today I'd like to go through MRP, cost of bill of materials, and if we have time, go through the production time tracking solution we've built. So from a planning and inventory standpoint, NetSuite have built a solution called the MRP. It used to be something called time phased, and that's been now, I think in the next release or next couple of releases, it's going to become obsolete. So that was the old way of planning your supply plan. Demand planning is still the same, but your supply planning has been re-updated and rebuilt to incorporate additional functionalities for a planner. So some of the actual challenges organizations have in inventory planning relates to not having visibility into the profitability of your inventory in terms of what you're selling. Manual reordering process. So the items haven't been set up to manage planning. Some of the other areas is having real-time visibility into stock and also seeing how well your vendors are performing as well. So in the last couple of releases, NetSuite's added a lot of investment around vendor performance and reporting and indicators around deliveries of your purchase orders and your inbound shipments and tying that back to how well have they performed against what they said they were going to do. So some of the actual functionalities that come out of NetSuite in relation to it include, the automated inventory profitability reporting, using MRP and supply planning in NetSuite, getting reminders when there's stock outs of particular bill of materials or finished products or inventory items, and also from a vendor side in terms of having scorecards and managing their performance accordingly. So as you're aware, most of you, use NetSuite from a distribution and manufacturing today, so this is not new to you. So, you got your item management, and then that flows into lead to quote, order to cash. You're holding stock in a warehouse. If you go down on another level, you may have bin management where you're storing inventory in relation to bins. And if you go another step down, you're managing advanced warehouse management with RF capabilities. You're managing inventory transactions, which is what you do when you're moving stock. You're making inventory adjustments. You're receiving purchases and the like, which impacts inventory, and then you're analyzing that inventory and your vendor performance and associated to that. But today I want to talk about demand planning and MRP specifically. So there's two types of planning in terms of inventory in NetSuite. Now that's inventory, whether it's assembly inventory with the relevant assembly and bill of material items sitting underneath it, or it can just be your inventory items that you're just selling and you're buying and you're selling. There's two ways to actually plan those. One of those is through a reorder point, which is what most of you may be aware of, where you select the replenishment method in the item, which I'll show you later. And then that drives for each and every warehouse a particular quantity of reorder point that you may have or may want. So when that quantity of inventory falls below that reorder point value, then the system will basically create a suggestion for you in the order items reminder to view those. But today I want to focus on MRP. So MRP specifically is around using demand planning and supply planning in NetSuite. So demand planning solution is either using historical sales to then drive your demand plan. And there's different calculation methods that NetSuite uses in order to calculate the demand plan. So it can use moving average, linear regression, seasonal trends, sales, pipelines, or orders in the system to use those as your demand, as well as importing CSVs as well. So when you're planning demand, you're planning at a item, location, combination level. Now, you can also use history from other items as well in order to drive that demand if there's not enough history of a particular item because it may be new. And it then drives, based on either a weekly or monthly bucket, the relevant demand plan for those future months. And then based on that demand is what the supply plan uses and MRP uses to drive the relevant planned purchase orders or planned work orders or planned transfer orders to move stock or buy stock or make stock. Now, some of the actual parameters you need in the MRP side is obviously lead times. So this can be lead times for your supplier or production lead times. That can also incorporate safety stock levels as well. Lot sizing methods, so lot for lot, fixed lot, or periods of supply. It's just elements that are set up on the item record, on the warehouse, on the purchasing tab on the warehouse level. And you got consumption days, time fence, and reschedule window as well. And then from a setup standpoint, in terms of the MRP setup, this is where you'll go in and actually set up your relevant planning item categories, your planning groups, and all those other elements, which actually get allocated and assigned to the relevant items. And that's how you therefore plan in relation to how you execute the MRP to then have that planning workbench to view those relevant items you're planning. So you can actually look at the demand and supply, which I'll take you through as we go. So once the MRP is generated and those replenishment orders or those replenishment orders, whether they're transfer orders for moving stock from one location to another. So you may have the demand as being a particular location that is where the supply is being sourced from. That's where the transfer orders come in. Compared to purchase orders is, you're basically having a demand where that item is an actual item that is an inventory item which is purchased. And as a result, it's going to suggest the purchase order compared to a work order, which is an assembly item. And as a result, it will suggest a work order for those compared to a purchase order or a transfer order. Now, on an assembly item as well, I'm not sure you may know, but you can also have an assembly item that is also enabled for purchasing as well. So it can drive whether it's a purchase or whether it's a manufactured at the location warehouse level. So one location maybe we're purchasing for that assembly item, another location maybe we're actually making it. And that's how the system knows what it needs to suggest based on that. So that's a bit of the MRP, and this then goes into the whole element of driving a demand plan. Is it a sellable item? No. Then go to MRP and then execute from an MRP standpoint. So I'll take you through this flow in NetSuite so you can see it, how it goes from start to end. So top is all demand planning, and this is where you're driving the relevant demand planning methods in order to drive the demand plan, and that then pushes it into that demand plan is used in MRP to then calculate your supply plan. If it is MRP related, and if it's not and it's reorder point, then it will then basically utilize the replenishment triggers for the reorder point based on the safety stock, lead time, reorder point values, seasonal, to then create those suggested purchases or suggested work orders. And then if it's MRP, then obviously we'll go through the MRP process to generate the relevant transaction accordingly. And these are some of the reports as well that NetSuite has around the MRP and planning side. So let me jump into NetSuite and take you through that demo. So let me just drag it across, and you should be able to see NetSuite. No questions so far? No? Okay, cool. All right, so let's start off with the setup that's required to manage planning in NetSuite. So if I just jump into an existing item, so this is me jumping into an assembly item. And once I'm actually in the item, there is a field called the replenishment method field on the purchasing tab. So if I go down, you'll see down here there is a replenishment method, and this item has been selected as MRP, and then you can also select it for reorder point. Time phase is the one that's being made obsolete. So that was the old way of doing the supply planning, and then you've got MRP as well. There is also another option in addition to MRP called material production scheduling. It's the same as MRP. All it is just segregates the MRP ones to the MPS ones in the planning workbench, and I'll show you how that's done, because you may have one item that you may not wanting to put it. You may want to plan it for production compared to one that you're planning for MRP. So that's what drives it. And then you've got something called the item category in here, which you're actually stipulating how are you actually planning this individual item. So the item category in this case is a box culvert, and this culvert is therefore assigned to this item. So when you're planning it, it's going to be picking up those relevant items accordingly, which I'll show you next. So if I go to list, supply planning, this is where you've set up your item categories, right? So if I open this up, you'll see in the item categories, I've got all the individual item categories that I've assigned to the relevant items. So I've got ones that are, body, fixed, finished goods guides, so this is where you're assigning. And there's the one I actually had against that individual item, right? So that's your item categories where you're assigning them to the actual items. And then you've got your item groups. So you may want to actually group certain item categories together. So if I jump into the classic RC box culvert, this is where I'm actually grouping multiple item categories together, because I'm actually planning against an item group that has all these item categories tied to it. Now, you may just have individual item categories and you're planning those item categories. So when you're generating a supply plan, you're planning at the item category level, or you can consolidate up into an item group, which is what I've done here. And then the next part is the rule group that you set up. So the rule group is where you're actually setting up the transportation lane. So for instance, sourcing inventory from another location instead of sourcing it from a supplier or from a work order. And that's what these planning rules do. So for instance, for this particular planning category, steel bar, we are actually transferring inventory from source location in Coatings Gateshead to the R&R Gatehead location. So that means that the actual source location, this is where the actual demand will be sitting against for this particular products that are assigned to steel bar item category. And as a result, we'll always incorporate a lead time of 5 days. So this is where you set up those planning rule groups where you're managing inventory that's being sourced from a location and not from a supplier or from manufacturing. And then the last one is where you're actually creating your individual views on the workbench. And this will make sense when we actually go into the workbench and you take a look at, it's just creating an individual view where you're listing or restricting or categorizing what items you want to see in the workbench, right? So this is a save search. You use save searches to then show these items is what I want to see in this particular view. Or I can also do it based on item category or item type or, and so on and so forth, right? So that's just the setup side of it. So you turn MRP on in the enable features. You allocate the items with the replenishment method, and then you go and set up your item categories and your item groups, and then you set up your planning groups for any items that are sourced from other locations, and then you're pretty much ready to go from that point on, right? So next part is actually now executing the process. So if I go into transactions, demand planning, and then take you through to calculate demand plan, this is where you're actually executing the demand plan based on the replenishment methods that we discussed earlier. So for instance, if I chose a particular location, in this case, Sydney, the production method. So how are you actually projecting the demand in terms of what method are you using to projecting based on your history. The only one that doesn't use history sales forecast, so it actually uses actual sales to drive your demand. So then you say linear regression, and then you have the ability of planning into weekly buckets or monthly buckets. And then based on the duration that you're planning ahead, so if I choose weeks, I'm going to be planning based on 52 weeks. And the historical that I'm using in order to drive that projection is, I don't know, we want to use the last 12 weeks of history to then, because that's the most accurate, because the others are, you know, anything more than that may be clunky and not accurate. And then you select your individual items, and then once you've executed it, then it will therefore create your demand plan. And this demand plan will look something like this. And you have the ability to also import as well, like I said earlier. And if I go into that one there, when I ran it last for moving average, for 12 months, I ran it monthly. Moving average, projection date was the 1st of July this year. We're projecting forward 12 months, and we're using 12 months of historical. And that's basically the numbers that are drove out in terms of the quantities for each and every month. Okay, so that's the demand plan, right? Now, you can also go and edit this and actually update it as well on the fly, these quantities. And like I mentioned, you can also import them on CSV. And then once you've done that, the next part is to actually execute the supply plan, right? Now, what NetSuite's done is they've actually created a planning repository, right? Because in the past, using the time phase, which was the old way of doing supply planning, it tried to take everything in the database to then calculate the actual inventory or plan inventory you need. And for assembly items, it took a long time, because if you had sub-assemblies and multiple sub-assemblies that have other sub-assemblies tied to it, it had to explode the bill of materials and then try to work out, okay, for these bill of materials, what's the lead time? Is there any safety stock required? And so on and so forth. What's the inventory on the floor for that location, to then drive and try to calculate how much it needs of those bill of materials based on the quantities that are contained of demand for that finished product. And as a result, because it took so long to do, NetSuite have re-architected the whole thing and now actually created a planning repository where you're refreshing the actual database for planning. Now, that can be a complete refresh, or it can be a net change refresh, meaning that it only updates deltas that have changed. And this can be a scheduled job that basically gets updated every day before you plan your inventory. And you can also plan it based on supply plan definitions as well, which I'll take you into later in terms of the planning side of it. You know, you may have the supply plan definition of we're planning by supplier, or we're planning by these item groups. That's a supply plan definition, which uses those planning groups that I showed you, or those item categories, to then plan. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, then you just ping me and I'll try to re-explain it again. But yeah, it's you just need to get your head around item categories, plan groups, and then from that they all feed into the item, and then they then create your supply plan definition, and then it's what you're using in the supply plan definition to look at the planning workbench, which I'll take you in a minute, where you're actually looking at demand and supply, and it's generating those planned orders for you. So once you've done a complete refresh, the next part of the process, and you can see, if you see here, you can actually schedule it, that refresh, that repository refresh. And then in the supply plan definitions, which are what I've been talking about, I've actually got a couple here where I've created. So over here, I've created one called the classic fluid transfer couplings one, which is using 180 days of horizon. So we're planning 180 days ahead, and we're planning it based on the item category group of RC box culverts that has all those individual planning items tied to it, right? And these are all then tied to the individual items. And then the generate pegging component is whenever there is an actual supply order, whether it's a planned purchase order, a planned work order, a planned transfer order created, it will peg the demand to that. And that's what the generate pegging does. So that means that there is an actual order that gets created for that particular demand. Now, if I had this turned off, it would not be pegged, which means that it will then, if there's multiple demands for that particular period, it will aggregate those up and create one individual purchase request or work order, request or suggestion or transfer order suggestion. I hope that makes sense. but I've actually turned on pegging. So when you see those supply plan requisitions created for purchases and work orders and transfer orders, you'll be able to see the connection between the two. And in this case here, we're actually running it for Sydney, and we're using sales orders and a demand plan to drive the supply plan. And in addition, we're actually consuming the forecast. So what the consuming forecast does is it basically consumes each week what you haven't sold or haven't consumed. So for instance, if there's 4 weeks in a month and it's in a quantity of 40 for that month that your demand is expected to be, and you haven't in week 1 transpires and you haven't sold anything, then as a result the system would be using 30 because there's 4 weeks and there's 10 on each week. So it'll be using the 30 in order to plan, and then not considering the first 10 that never got sold. Hope that makes sense. So that's what the consume forecast does. So when you actually run it and execute the supply plan definition, right? And like I said, the supply plan definition is all based on however you want to plan your business, whether it's by group of items by supplier, whether it's group of items by location or planning group or whatever it is. That's how you create your supply plan definitions. And then once you've done that and you've executed it, then it will create a planning workbench for you. Now, the planning workbench is where all the information in terms of the generated supply records and transactions have been created. Now, they haven't created actual transactions. They've created planned transactions, which is a new transaction that NetSuite's created. So over here, you'll see that we're using this supply plan definition. The repository was last updated yesterday. The results we just generated it today, and we're looking at it from the 27th of July to the 23rd of January next year. So that's the time range we're looking at here. And as a result, we actually got a planning workbench. So this is where else a view, which is the view is based on that save search that I showed you when we go and set it up. So this is using that workbench view that I've set up, which is based on a save search. And then you have the ability to restrict it by, and this is your item filters, by the way. This is where you're restricting it based on whether it's an MRP product or an MPS product. And that's how you categorize one over the other, because you may want to have one separate planning view for production scheduling items, which are assembly, compared to your inventory items will be, with a replenishment method on the item selected for MRP, right? That's how it's been designed. And then you can also have the ability to filter as well by item, by location, by subsidiary, and the rest. All right, so that's the filtering component. I'll talk a little bit about the messaging in a second, where you've got different action types, right? Because these action types and exception types is what NetSuite will provide to you when it goes through the planning process. And you'll see a couple of here there where it's got these. There's 2 here that are enacted, need to be actioned. 2 has an exception. If I click on that 2, it will take me and say, oh, you need to consider releasing the planned purchase order because it's nearing the lead time threshold for this particular product. The same as for this one here. You need to look at potentially releasing this because it's nearing its lead time threshold as well. All right, so we go back to the summary. We're back to the main screen. Now, so this is the list of all individual items, the actual units in terms of how you're planning, the on-hand quantities that are in the warehouse today for that particular location. So at the moment, we're doing it based on Sydney, because you saw that earlier in the supply plan definition. We had set it up only for Sydney. And then the quantities of one order. So this is what is on order at the moment. If it's a production order, and if it's an assembly order, the reason why you know it's an assembly order because it's got a little arrow there. And if I drill down, it will have all the individual bill of materials sitting underneath it. Compared to these ones here are actually inventory items because they don't have the arrow next to it. All right, so you can see that one there is connected to that, and then that one is another assembly item that will then have its own set of sub-assemblies sitting underneath it as well. All right, so if I go across, you'll be able to see that there's a total supply of 4 that the system has suggested for this assembly item, based on demand of 6 items. So the 6 is the number of demand items that are tied to it, not the quantity. right? So you just need to make, and the same on the supply side. It's the number of lines, not the actual quantity. So from an actual demand plan, so when I went and ran the demand plan earlier, it would have therefore suggested based on individual demand and supply as to what you need to, what it's using in order to drive the actual individual supply, right? So in this example, let me go back. Let me go back and I'll choose the top product. I don't know. So let me get rid of that because I'm missing an item that I want to show you. That will come up here. So I wanted to show you that crank one, which has in these individual bill of materials tied to it. If I go into the supply, you'll see that in the demand, it has the individual demand that I showed you earlier from the demand plan, right? So it's basically incorporating for each and every month, August, September, October, November, December, the due date and the individual quantities for it based on that demand plan. And if I click on this little individual element here, you'll be able to see what's pegged to that individual demand plan. Because remember when I executed the supply plan definition, I had generate pegging, and this is how it's actually connecting the individual demand plan to the relevant planned work order. So it's not a released work order, it's not an actual work order, it's a planned work order, it's an intermediate work order that hasn't been released. So if you know work orders in NetSuite, the status of a work order, it's a planned work order or released work order, that's separate. That is an actual work order. So if it's in planned work order, it's different to this. This is an actual transaction that sits before an actual work order gets created. So you're converting these into an actual planned work order, if that makes sense. So terminology wise, it might be confusing, but this is an actual transaction that sits before an actual work order gets created into a plan or release state. I hope that makes sense. And you can actually see here that there's 120 of that demand plan. As a result, the system's going ahead and generated 120 of a planned work order that needs to be delivered by the 1st in order to meet that particular demand. Now, if there are lead times as well, the lead times will get incorporated into that as well. Right, so that's just from a demand perspective. If I click on go on the supply side, you'll see now the individual planned work orders that have been generated as well, and the respected pegging that is tied to it as well, which is the flip side of the pegging. So before we had demand plan with work order, now it's work order demand plan because we're looking at it from the supply side. All right, now when you're happy and you're wanting to proceed, you just go, okay, click, and this is now when you're actually releasing these work orders. Right, you have the ability to also go and create planned orders on the fly in addition to what the system suggested, or you can go and make your individual adjustments as well to these planned orders and change the quantities as well before you've actually gone and released them, if you want to, by clicking on it and going into the planned work order and making the relevant quantity changes on that planned work order. Any questions? I haven't seen any questions come through. Hopefully I haven't lost you all. Sorry, I just jumped out of my transaction. I go back to view results and I'll be back to where I was. Now, the other thing on this particular screen as well, when I'm actually on the main results screen, before I was in the individual ones here, right, where I clicked and took me into the actual supply and I can see the supply and so on and so forth. Let me just get rid of this. But you also have this little time icon, grid icon here, where if you click on it, it actually takes you into a date-based view, which can be both grid and graph view, where you actually see, okay, for this particular product, show me for a monthly, right? So you can also change the period size here, where it's daily, weekly, and monthly. You can actually see the unconsumed forecast, which is the demand plan. So for August, September, October, November, December, you can see the individual forecast. And then any particular sales orders, plan transfer orders, or transfer orders that were created, that actually incorporates the total demand. And then from that, you'll be able to therefore see where your, what the system is in terms of generated in terms of planned orders on a very high level view as well. And then what the projected value is of that inventory. And then if you want to look at a graph view, it also shows the graphical view on that as well. All right, so that's just a nice little view you can have for that particular item. If you click on the item, we'll take it to the item record. So that's what that click does, just jumps in the item record. Now, if I go back into the supply plan, we're now going to release this particular work order. So, yep, we're now wanting to release it. And then this will then push it into a release state, which will then firm the actual, which will firm that particular planned work order. And this is where it actually goes in and runs it as an actual batch. All right. And then once that happens, that will then turn into a firmed. And then what you do after that point, once it's firmed, you'll then go and release that particular particular work order or particular purchase order or particular transfer order. So it's here where you're actually doing the releasing. All right. So once it's been released here, then those transactions will get created under these three items. So this creates purchase orders, this creates work orders, and this creates transfer orders depending on the actual supply transaction it's created, which is based on the item type that's specific to that item. So over here, if I jump into one down the bottom here and jump into it, you'll see that supply here, it's not generated supply because there's no demand for it and just showing a quantity compared to over here. If I go into the Puppet one of 5, you'll be, these are all work order related. So let me just go to one where I can get some nozzles, just going to show on quantity guide. You can see these ones here, they're purchases. Right, so if I release these, this will then go and release those as planned released purchase orders that then will be able to be then created as purchase orders or as work orders under these specific transactions. So when I jump into those two transactions, and you also saw the other one for transfer orders, I'm not going to take you through that. You'll see over here that this is where you see those, right? So if they're reorder points, items where they're flagged as a replenishment method as reorder point, you'll see those items in here and the quantities that sit below us. If I just select Sydney and we're looking at it for all and take a look at the plant orders, just loading at the moment. This is where you now go and say, I'm going to be releasing it for this purchase order, and it's already picked the actual default supplier from the item record, and you can change it if you want to, and then you can just submit that, and it'll go and create that purchase order for you through a batch job. Compared to the work order one, which is very similar, you also have the ability to do the planned work orders. Otherwise, you'll see your planned work orders that were created from that were released in the workbench, right? That were released in here. You'll see them here, and then you'll do the same thing. I'm going to release that. I'm going to release that and release that. Otherwise, if you want to make changes, you can update them, those quantities here on the fly as well. And you can also see what's back ordered, what's on order, and what's available as well. Does it automatically consolidate suppliers? Unfortunately, it will only create one purchase order and not consolidate them. So in the order items page, it doesn't actually consolidate them when you're actually releasing your orders. So actually, if you have 2 lines with the same supplier, it won't actually go and create one PO for them. Actually, we'll go and create 2 individual purchase orders, unfortunately. So that's demand and supply planning in NetSuite through MRP. Like I said, it's been around for the last probably, and they keep on adding more and more features to it. So for instance, in the last release, they've gone and added a workbench view. In the previous release before that, they've gone and added this other view, pegging view as well. In the release before that, this is where they've gone and added more date-based views, and the grid view only I think came last release as well. So they're putting in a lot of effort in terms of trying to get this planning workbench up and running and fully featured compared to what they had in the old time-phased equivalent years ago. Okay, so from a list perspective, not sure for those who are in manufacturing. There are some nice little reports that you can use from a manufacturing standpoint. Just trying to remember where it is now. because the problem is every single one of these roles has its own individual setup. So we got manufacturing. So I'm not sure if any one of you have used these transactions: costed bill of material inquiry, components, where use list, transaction. So this is just showing you for an individual subsidiary for a particular component what finished products does it actually sit against, right? So so you can see here for that individual component, it's used against all these individual assembly items, right? And you can see, okay, how much is in stock? Is it in level 1 or sub-assembly level 2 or 3 or 4 that it sits under? How much is on hand? How much is available, back ordered? Compared to the costed bill of material one is the other way around. It actually looks at it from the assembly item all the way down to the individual bill of materials, including sub-assemblies. All right, so you can see here for that subsidiary, for that item, it's got one bill of material, one revision. So you can have multiple revisions as well. So a revision is where you may have an old recipe or older recipe, and the recipe is now being superseded by a new recipe. So you can see these individual revisions and their respective effective dates that tie back to those revisions based on, and the revision is the bill of materials and the quantities, and it's effectively the recipe. And then which is effectively this here that you see here. So you can see here that that's the bill of material that you would have seen when I was in the planning workbench, and this is the sub-assembly that sits underneath it, which is an inventory item. And you can see the actual relevant costs that pertain to that as well. What's the level? I hope I answer your question correctly. The level is the sub-assembly level. So you may have a assembly item as a parent that has another assembly item as a bill of material under it, and therefore it may have another set of inventory items or sub-assembly items, which are assembly items sitting underneath. And so you could have multi-level sub-assembly levels. I hope that's what your question was about. So that's what these levels are. As you can see here, that one is another assembly item that then feeds into another assembly item, which is 2 levels down, which has these bill of materials connected to it. And then same as this one, this is another level even going down, another level going down, and so on and so forth. All right, so this nice little view when you're looking at it in terms of all the individual sub-assemblies. That was MRP in a nutshell. That's pretty much all I wanted to walk through today, is MRP. Reorder point, on the other hand, it's relatively easy and simple. So if I just go into one of the item records, it's literally just going in and choosing the replenishment method to be a reorder point. And then once you've got that, then you'll go into the individual items and then basically put across the relevant reorder point quantities at the individual item record. I'm just trying to find this. This is an assembly item. So this is the build point that you would put down for it. And then that's how we'll therefore drive what needs to be manufactured based on the build point versus reorder point. It would be for inventory items, and then it would basically based on the reorder point on those. That's all I wanted to take you through today. If you have any questions or anything on this, please reach out. If we have an item which is sold directly to customers as well as used in bill of materials, is MRP taking that into account? If the item is sold directly to a customer, so that is this an assembly item? I assume this will be an assembly item where it's sold out of stock, and therefore it's sold out of stock. Then the demand plan will take that into just as a straight part. It will, yes, because if you're selling the bill of material to a customer, that particular sales order will be incorporated into the MRP because there is demand for it, and as a result, it will then plan and want you to either manufacture or procure that bill of material in order to meet that sales order demand, whilst incorporating the demand plan for that finished product that you're making as well. So yeah, it incorporates both. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining today. This session's recorded, so you'll definitely also get a recording sent to you via email in case you want to share it with anyone, and then later on it'll also be on YouTube as well. So yeah, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions specific to your business. Happy to help. So yeah, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much.